So tomorrow's going to be National Mourning Day for President George H.W. Bush. He remains lying in state at the Capitol. Of course, numerous folks have been going through the Capitol, paying their respects. One of the folks who has been involved in the planning of the state funeral is Fred McClure, who served as special assistant to President George H.W. Bush. He's a native Texan, first black student body president at my alma mater, Texas A&M University. Fred, glad to have you on the show.
Roland, good to be here. Thanks a bunch.
First and foremost, your thoughts on the passing of President Bush, someone you have known for a quite long time, working also at the Bush Library there in Texas A&M.
Yes, I've had the privilege of knowing the president for 39 years, and actually 10 years after I met him, I joined the White House staff as Assistant for Legislative Affairs and ran the congressional operation for the president for the first 3 years of his term. I returned to Texas more recently in 2012 and was the CEO of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation.
Well, you talk about his legacy. For you, 39 years, obviously a long time, very personal connection there. But what do you consider to be the greatest triumphs of his 4 years as president?
Well, you know, one of the interesting things, you're talking with Congressman Scott there, and with the change in hands of the House of Representatives, when President Bush was president, neither the House nor the Senate was a Republican-led, and so it required us in everything that we tried to do to make sure that we approached it in a way which had some bipartisan flavor associated with it. Otherwise, we couldn't get anything done, whether that was the American with Disabilities Act, whether that was the first reauthorization of the Clean Air Act, and other pieces of legislation on the domestic front. Likewise, the president has a pretty strong legacy, I believe, on the foreign affairs front. He did some things that were probably against conventional wisdom, which probably were politically uncomfortable, and those who might thought it was the wrong thing to do. For example, with Saddam Hussein, he didn't go trudging into Iraq. We just got him out of Kuwait, which is what the president's objective was. And of course, he presided over the reunification of Germany and the change in the Soviet Union. So those were kinds of things that took place during his 4 years, which I think will have a lasting impact. One of the biggest things in terms of going against conventional wisdom, I think, was when he reneged on his no new taxes pledge. He did so because it was the right thing to do to get the budget deal that we needed to get to keep the economy churning back during the early 1990s. So I think ultimately, as we look back upon his legacy of service, from being a congressman to being ambassador to the UN, to envoy to China, and of course 8 years as vice president and president, that with the passage of time, as I think has been demonstrated over the last few days, that there is another look at the way in which he approached governing and what he did in terms of dealing with folks on the other side of the aisle as well as those people in his own political party.
Yeah, obviously, when a president or a member of Congress, a U.S. senator passes, folks reflect and mourn in different ways, but also there are others who say there should be a very clear look at legacy. We had a conversation yesterday where folks talked about, obviously, the things that you mentioned. Also, we had Louis Sullivan on, Armstrong Williams on. We also had folks who talked about the issue of the appointment of Clarence Thomas, the Willie Horton ad during the campaign as well. How would you describe his legacy specifically about African Americans, or to African Americans?
Well, I had the responsibility for getting Clarence Thomas confirmed as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court as a Legislative Affairs Assistant for the President. And after the President made his decision that Clarence was going to be his candidate, then my job was to make sure and get enough votes to accomplish that task, and we succeeded in doing it. And we had bipartisan support for his nomination. It wasn't a straight party line vote. And so that was what we tried to do when the President made the decision to choose Clarence Thomas as the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. It comes with the territory. A president is generally expected to nominate someone who he feels, or she feels, as the case may be, does what he wants on the court in terms of the interpretation of the Constitution and how they would serve as a justice, because they get to serve an awful long time. President also nominated David Souter, which was his first nominee to the Supreme Court. So those, in a 4-year time frame, the president was lucky enough to have those two opportunities to affect the Supreme Court of the United States.
Last question. Obviously, you have a national day of mourning tomorrow. So many people are also talking about how he led in terms of stature as well, and what that is going to mean moving forward in terms of how we look at presidents in terms of, and when you look at the partisan rancor now, clearly I don't think you can even remotely compare what took place in 1980 to 1992 to what's happening today. I mean, it's a stark contrast to how divided the nation is.
I think the nation comes together at times like this because of people who have given of themselves to serve as president of the United States. There have only been like 45 of them. If you reflect back to 2006 when President Ford passed away, we had a similar moment where people came together and reflected favorably from both sides of the aisle upon President Ford and his contributions, either as a congressman for a short time as vice president and ultimately for his one term as president. Shortly after President Ford passed away, and he was buried the latter part of December of that year, Congress went back to its normal rancor here in Washington, D.C., and the same back and forth between the White House and Capitol Hill emerged once again. You know, one of the advantages I had in 1992 with Clarence Thomas, or 91 with Clarence Thomas, was that, you know, there wasn't just a whole lot of different mechanisms available to transmit news and to have people. We had like 3 networks and some little thing called CNN. That was it. And those are the kinds of issues that I had to worry about. We didn't have a 24/7 news cycle. We didn't have everybody with a cell phone who has the ability to be their own producer, director, and publisher, as the case may be. So the times have changed dramatically, and I think what's happened is that our edges have hardened, and as those edges have hardened, the divide in the middle has gotten larger and larger. So the question always becomes, who's going to be the candidate that comes to the forefront and gives of him or herself in such a fashion that they can garner the interest of enough of the American people. President Obama did it beautifully, and the same thing happened, I think, when we got defeated by President Clinton. But as you look back over the lives of those individuals, I think you will see that upon reflection, most of them tried to do the best job that they could do for the benefit of the American people.
All right, Fred McClure.
Let me add one other thing, Roland. I was telling these guys earlier when we were back in the green room, my dad was an alpha at Prairie View A&M University.
Yes, sir. See, there you go. See, you got to work that in.
I got to work that in. It's birthday time. It's birthday time.
All right, then. Fred McClure, always good to see you.
Thanks, buddy.
And we'll be sure to catch up when we're back in Texas.
Thank you. Be safe in your travels.
All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
As we transition into the holiday season, this is the time, of course, when we start thinking about giving and sharing. Sometimes the best gift that you can give someone is an opportunity that could potentially change their lives financially. That's why our friends at Transatlantic Real Estate have created an investment opportunity for the everyday investor. It involves legal marijuana and crowdfunding. Now look, you know, black folks have been impacted by marijuana in a negative way. Now the issue is it is legal in so many areas. It is one of the fastest growing industries in the country. Yeah, and we also know that crowdfunding makes it easy to be an early investor of an opportunity. It's a no-brainer. But it also gets even better. Transatlantic Real Estate is different, and they have a business model that is simple to understand. They buy land that supports marijuana grow operations and lease it to licensed, high-paying tenants. Now, here's the piece. You're investing in a landlord of a licensed marijuana farm in a high-growth market. And for a limited time, you can invest as little as $300 up to $10,000 before the company goes public. And here's some more good news. They have recently extended the offer, which means you still have time if you take action now. Now, keep in mind, you must complete and confirm your application to participate. So be sure to complete the process. And don't spend all of your money over the holidays and end up with empty pockets. Instead, get a return on your investment. You could also consider making an investment for someone special. How's that for a holiday gift? I think it's a good idea. Now, to get started, go to marijuanastock.org and marijuanastock.org for you to get in the game.
Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered.